Hello, my name is Renee Nicholson, and I am director of the Humanities Center at West Virginia University. And this is our series, Short Talks. And today I'm here with Shaun Slifer, the author of So Much to Be Angry About, Appalachian Movement Press and Radical DIY Publishing, 1969 to 1979. And that was published by our friends over at the West Virginia University Press. And I'm going to borrow from their summary, which says the book conjures an influential but largely obscured strand in the nation's radical tradition, the movement printing presses and publishers of the late 1960s and 1970s, and specifically Appalachian Movement Press in Huntington, West Virginia, which is the only movement press in Appalachia. More than a history, this craft and activist-centered book positions the frontline politics of the Appalachian left within larger movements of the 1970s. So welcome, Shaun, and
Thank
we're going
you.
to have a fun talk today, I hope. And just to get started, how did you get interested in the Appalachian Movement Press and in these sort of radical DIY publishing outfits?
Right. So I think it starts with being a teenager and being immersed in punk culture and DIY culture as we defined it then, making our own publications, sort of recording our own music. That's the culture that I grew up in and sort of maintain a connection to. And I think I'm always on the lookout for something obscure, historically speaking. Like I like to dig for the stories that aren't out there yet. And so in this particular case, I actually happened to be at a wedding, and I write about this a little bit in the intro to the book. I was at a wedding, I think it's been 3 years now, at the Appalachian South Folklife Center in Pipestem, West Virginia.
Mhm.
And my friend, one of the people who was getting married, said, he's like, oh man, you got to learn about the history of this place. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know where I was really. And he said, you'd really like the people that founded this place. And he handed me this what I would call a zine, which was, and I have it, I own it now, but at the time he handed me this publication, A Time for Anger, and said, check this out. And he walked away because it was his wedding and he had to, so I got to talk to everybody. And I was flipping through, I was like, okay, it's poetry. And there's some really intense images in here of lynchings and whatnot. And there was a little emblem on the back that said Appalachian Movement Press. So I texted a picture of that to a couple of friends of mine who were also interested in underground publishing and the history of that in the United States. And I said, check this out. And that was it, and they said, that's really cool. And then a couple of days later, they run a publication called Signal, which is published on PM Press. And that they asked me to write a story about the press for their publication, which is a global publication. And I said, I don't know anything about them. And they said, that's okay, you can find out. And so that's where the research started. And so that was an interesting opportunity to they had never done a story about anything in the southeast of the United States or Appalachia as a part of that. So that is a very leftist graphics publication. And so it was an opportunity to tell an Appalachian story in that context. So I started digging.
Wow. So you never know where a random moment in a wedding will take you, right?
Exactly. Yeah, right.
Which is, I think a lot of times when we're working with students, they think they have to, get their ideas from someplace super scholarly. And I'm going to have this very important thought, and then it's going to turn into a research paper, right? But really,
Sure.
you can be living your life and the material finds you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the interest came from things that were organic for me. I mean, it became originally just the pursuit of who made these zines, because these look like the kind of zines that I would have picked up, at a show, even when I was a teenager, but they're obviously of another age, So for me, this was in the early and mid 1990s, but these publications were from the early 1970s and they had that look and feel to them, but I'm still holding it. I mean, it had just, the pamphlet that my friend handed to me had literally just been sitting on a table in the main cafeteria hall of the Folklife Center. So it
Wow.
was an active, it wasn't like it was under glass, it was just actively out
Yeah.
for people to see. So that familiarity for me is where the research came from, like you
Wow.
said. I mean, obviously my friends pushed me to do this, right? But
Sure, sure. Yeah, you have this encounter, you send it like, look at this cool thing, and then you get that push, right? And then, yeah, sometimes that's all we need is that little push, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, now I'm interested. Now I'm interested. I'm invested, and I have a project.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And as somebody who, read quite a few zines, music zines, Riot Girl zines in the 90s, that feels very organic too. So
Exactly, exactly. Close to home.
yeah, very close to home. So, and, one of the things that's really cool about the AMP press is they were addressing things that we're still talking about today, right? Sustainability and environmentalism, feminism, class, all sorts of class issues, other things. And so, um, what do you think that these, zines from this time period can do to speak to us in our current moment?
Um, I I think a couple of things happen. On the front end, um, it can be demoralizing to see, for example, the level of struggle on all fronts against something like strip mining for
Mhm,
coal having happened, it started before my lifetime, and actually still being an issue.
mhm,
That's hard. That's hard to grapple with. Uh, at the same time, I think that when you have a sense of the precedent for what you're concerned about now, and a precedent that there are ancestors and people that came before you that were fighting that fight, and in fact had victories that maybe you didn't know about, that I think gives, at least for me, a better sense of historical scale and a sense of my place in that history. Um, when I moved to Pittsburgh, where I live now, about 16 years ago from Middle Tennessee, and at that time, I was aware of the anti-mountaintop removal activism scene, was peripherally a part of that, so that when I got more and more into Appalachian history, that actually was my frame. And so when I was reading some of the stuff that Appalachian Movement Press was putting out that was about strip mining, it was like backtracking for me. Um, yeah, it's a struggle. I mean, that's just sort of one example of what they were writing about, but
sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, I mean, that was something that, as I was reading the book, I was like, wow, we are still grappling with these things now. We're still invested in that. But I'm glad that you also brought up the victories that that we didn't know about that now we would, right? And that's
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah. I believe it's and I'm just totally paraphrasing this, but I think in the introduction to Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, he says something to the effect of, uh, to read about struggles for justice in this country is almost to read a history of defeats, a litany of defeats, and it really can feel that way,
Mhm.
and often is. But yeah, it's like when you have to celebrate the victories where they are. One of the founders of Appalachian Movement Press, when I finally got a hold of him to interview him, he was almost the most detached from the memory of what they had done, of any of the other people I contacted. And
Mhm.
part of it for him was that he felt like what they wanted to do had failed. And he
Mhm.
was a little bit mystified, I think, why I was interested in it, some over 40 years later, why I thought it mattered. Um,
Wow.
and when we talked about it, I think that made more sense to him. But I think for him, he went on to be a very successful union organizer, and was sort of focused his work more than he had been doing in his early 20s when they were running this press. So that made sense to me organically too. But part of it even was just to tell him, like, I think people in movement now need to know that you were there and what you were doing, whether or not you think it was a failure, right? Because we also learned from those failures, I think.
Right, right. Absolutely. Well, and one of the things that is interesting about your book is that details, a movement press in a rural context, and you mentioned in the book how many of these happened in urban spaces, right? And so to have this really shining example, and we might think it's curious that one of the founders wouldn't understand, like, this is really important. You've saved this, piece of rural history, and those things get lost. There's more out there on the urban movement presses. And maybe you can talk about that just a little bit, because I think
Sure.
that kind of ties in with this person saying, why are you contacting me now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, it's rare that I've lived anywhere that was cool. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's actually true for most people. And I have it, I lived in Nashville for a while, which is cool to some people, and I miss it. But, uh, I think that's part of it. I personally don't need to read about another amazing, radical publication that comes out of Berkeley, California. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like I don't like, it's not that I'm going to ignore those things, but for every one of those, you know that there's someone in rural Montana who was like effectively trying to pull off the same thing, or would have wanted to know about that, like as a kid or something. I mean, I really sometimes kind of take it back to my early teenage self, and like how I was searching for culture in the United States at that time, right? Like, what did I plug into that was real? So I think exposing that these things can happen in a rural setting, and in fact, in this case, in Huntington, West Virginia, like, um, for people who are searching for it, opens that up. Like, wow, this was like right here. This was right here, and it was cool. It was of this place, but it was part of something national, if not global in some contexts. But it also breaks up stereotypes, even for, I think, people who might not be interested necessarily in an activist press, but it starts to complicate the idea of what, in this case, Central Appalachia is, for
Right.
people who have no familiarity with it, or more broadly, what rural activism looks like.
Right.
It often has exactly the same things going on as urban activism, but the context is different, right?
Sure.
And it's, yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's what that work is about.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And, kind of thinking about that, cultural stereotype, one of the things you do really, really intentionally in the book and is to talk about race in a way that, gets past, sort of that white homogenized Appalachian, right? And you talk about it in even in beyond race to like the heteronormative sort of view that a lot of people have of people in Appalachia, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that too, because that kind of hits on that same, the context is different. It's not, things are different than you think they are. You got to kind of dig into this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the more complex and, as you say, I think, delicate parts of trying to write the book, because I felt a responsibility to work on that issue as part of it, to tease that out, of the story. So again, part of it is about stereotype coming from the outside, um, and part of it was a challenge what is it that we conceive of as Appalachian
Mm-hmm.
right now. So I mean, my background as a activist, as a person thinking about these issues, is that I'm always looking at myself. I'm always sort of learning to challenge male heteronormative whiteness as the norm,
Mm-hmm.
and break that up. So it followed that once I started getting into Appalachian movement press, it was like, okay, I'm going to put that lens on for
Mm-hmm.
this too. And I think, though, that it's really easy to just kind of damn something from the past and say, like, okay, well, this press was, sort of just like level a standard critique and leave it at that. well, they failed because, here, obviously it was problematic. I don't want to do that because I think, there was a ton of evidence that they were working in an anti-racist way for that time and place. A lot of them, particularly Don West, who it was kind of the old left luminary that kind of was a major part of Appalachian Movement Press, who's still a respected figure today. Don West had consistently an anti-racist ethic to his work as an organizer for decades, but we would look at it differently now. I think we would use different language, or we would maybe actually in some cases be really alarmed
Mm-hmm.
by the way that someone would have written about something 40 years ago.
Sure.
And I think it was just it was a process of, at that time, the Appalachian identity movement, which I think it's like, you might not, for some people, might not realize that there were these identity-based movements at other times in history that in some ways mirror that, a return to that now. What the Appalachian identity movement was in response to other national cultural identity movements. And that was fascinating to me, right? Because it actually does frame a lot of what we talk about now in terms of preservation of culture. And so I was fascinated, for example, by the Young Patriots organization, who were these white Appalachians in a diasporic community in Chicago, whose mutual aid networks or street gangs, which is kind of, they can often be the same thing, politicized, and then began working in the Rainbow Coalition with, for example, the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And what was their identity as Appalachians out of Appalachia? Well, for them, it was very much about being white, and then understanding that and working with their own in collective movement with other organizations.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and it's always tricky when you're looking back to a different cultural moment and where our understanding is now. And I think one of the things that I appreciated about your book is how that's framed. And uh, yeah, you looked at the work of Elizabeth Catt, and then some of the work that Queer Appalachians, am I getting that right?
Mhm.
Have been doing around these issues as well. So that was very thoughtful context, especially if you're not, if this is brand new to you, you have a little bit of footing there. So
And we're always moving forward. I mean, I think that's kind of what keeps me, I was sort of like cringed and also laughed to myself as I was writing those parts, thinking, how useless is this book going to feel to somebody 40 years from now? Like what are the parts that they're going to be like, I can't believe he said that, because we're in a revolutionary time now, and I feel like we have been for several years. And so there's, particularly with language, really, really rapid movement, right? And so it's like, how do you kind of maintain relevancy as you right?
sure.
So, but I think it's important to point out, most of the authors, if not all of them, in Appalachian Movement Press, and the people who operated the presses, and the people who made that distribution work, were white.
Hmm.
And so I think that bears pointing out, right?
Yeah.
And what their conception of Appalachian was, as Yvonne Farley, one of my interviewees, said. She said most people weren't calling Black folks hillbillies, right? Like, that was like,
Right.
we were reclaiming hillbilly, which
Right.
was often a white identity by exclusion. But
Sure. Sure. Yeah. That makes good. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, one of the other things that I wanted to touch on here in our short talk is, yeah, you have a lot of source material that is visual, that are artifacts, if I can call them that, and you collected up all this information, and it really makes the book sort of an act of curation, if I can use that word for it. But I was
like
hoping
that.
you could kind of walk us through some of that, and talk about like how you found this stuff. How did you collect it up? Like, how did you start working with all this material? Because it's really fascinating.
I try really hard not to be a collector, but this gave me an opportunity to collect some very obscure stuff. I had an excuse. I'm going to put it in this book, right? So I have to collect it all so that I can have it in front of me. Um, and in fact, and so this is like I bought this recently, and the book is already almost finished. I don't really need this, but it was available online, and I saw it, and I thought, well, I better get it because like it's just going to sort of languish in this bookstore, and this was in San Francisco. All right, so
Wow.
um,
It
I
was in
found
San
them.
Francisco?
Yeah, at
Wow.
an amazing kind of like collector's bookstore, but it had made its way across the country somehow or another. Um, there were several ways that I found this stuff. I mean, a couple of them were given to me early on. Um, there was quite a bit of searching online. So prior to this work, in most cases, even in university archives, it hadn't been these publications weren't brought together as the product of a single publisher or imprint. They were typically scattered by author or title, and it took me some time even to sort of accumulate information about what titles they had printed. Um, or what was out there. So it wasn't that easy to just Google Appalachian Movement Press and go over to this source and start buying those things. That did happen in some cases, but um, and then a really early experience I had when I was working on the original article for Signal was that I went back to the Appalachian South Folklife Center in Pipestem. And this was founded by Don and Connie West, who I spoke of earlier, as a sort of cultural preservation and teaching and service work organization. And I went back there just to see what they had. And a friend of mine was the director there for a short time. And I was mostly there scanning the documents that he had found. And then I was only there for like 24 hours. And then towards the end of it, he said, you should go look in the basement in the chapel. Because some of these I found them down there, but it's a mess. And so I went over to this little chapel that they have and around the side to the basement. And what I found in there was what I think was just everything that got moved from Huntington when the press closed. So when they closed Appalachian Movement Press, they actually brought all the equipment to Pipestem, the offset presses, and Don West's plan had been to reboot those presses at Pipestem, and it looks like that never happened to any large degree. They got at least one publication out as Mountain Freedom Press at the time.
Wow.
But everything else was thrown in this basement, from what I could tell.
Oh my
So
goodness.
there were milk crates and Tupperware containers of half printed stuff or full publications that just hadn't been bound and folded. And then a lot of publications that, just had never been sold. And I mean, I think people were not concerned that it be preserved because it didn't seem important anymore. And so I was frustrated by the Appalachian Folklife Center, but I also know as a person who's been in movement for several years, like you don't always archive your own culture in the moment that you're making it. And one of the things about Appalachian Movement Press is they were very much in the moment. Like this is important right now. We have to get this out to people. Right. Like
Yeah.
and so they weren't concerned with authorship and they weren't concerned with preservation. Like this is where I came in. So I found all this stuff and I was like, what the hell? Like it's all in these milk crates. And some of them actually I don't think I pulled one here, but some of them, the publications that I have this telltale rust where the staples are
Oh
that
wow.
is from the moisture in that basement.
Oh my
So
goodness.
you'll see a little bit of that in the reproductions and on the cover of the actual book where the designer Thanseph actually like maintains some of that rust, which for me now is indicative of most of the publications that exist that came from
Wow.
there.
Yeah. And the immediacy, like now you would just put it on, online, right? In some way. Yeah. You could publish it at HuffPost or Medium or on Twitter or wherever. But
Yeah.
then it was make the pamphlet and start passing it around.
You
Like,
had to own the means of production too.
yeah. Yeah.
actually. You know, the way that Appalachian Movement Press got started, they were college students at Marshall who were members of SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, and it took them a long time to get college recognition for their SDS chapter, and they had a paper, and they printed the paper with a local printer who was sympathetic until he got some pressure to stop printing their newspaper. And so
Oh,
then at that point they were like, well, now we got to go get an offset press. And
right.
apparently he was still pretty helpful with them, helping them make the printing plates and stuff like that. But they had to go get a press because the nature of what they were publishing was challenged too, you know. So it
Sure.
wasn't like you could just go to Kinko's and run off whatever you wanted to without any kind of oversight.
Right. Right. Yeah. Which now seems archaic, right? You know, nobody goes to Kinko's. Although it
Yeah,
makes me
yeah. I
long
mean, you
for
just,
my youth.
yeah, yeah, right.
Well,
You
this is
might if you have to, you know, but
yeah,
yeah.
right, right. But yeah, well, this is fascinating. We could, talk forever on this, but since I have called these short talks, but a way to kind of maybe close our conversation here is, we have a lot of humanities students and scholars on our campus, and I just wanted to kind of ask what you hope that those folks understand about your work and about this book.
I think you know, part of it for me is you know, kind of demystifying the process of archiving and preservation and suggesting that uh, the preservation of culture can be the use of that culture. And I've taken that slogan from my friends at the Interference Archive, which is a people's archive in Brooklyn, New York, that use is preservation. In other words, we have to keep telling these stories and keep this stuff out there for people for it to be in people's sphere as they move forward. And that's not a knock on more institutional archives because the work they do is absolutely critical. It's just to kind of open up the idea of what the sharing of history can be.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful way to end. I thank you for spending some time with me today.
Thanks
And
for inviting me.
yes, and you can find Shaun's book at WVU Press's site. And again, always check out what we've got going on at humanityscenter.wvu.edu.